for the session and turn it over to our facilitator. But before we get started, we have a couple poll questions just to kick things off and to get a little information from about those of you that have joined this session today. So our first poll question, and before I start here, I want to note, I'm going to put the link in the chat. But if you are using your phone and you were previously participating in the other poll, you will need to leave the other poll and then join my poll because it is a different poll. So you'll need to text leave in your phone to leave the other poll and then join my poll by texting Shore to 22333. Then you'll get that confirmation that you joined and you can start answering the poll questions. Don't click on that link in the poll. So I'm going to give everybody a few more seconds just to get situated, figure out how to use the poll.
And they asking to go anywhere? They're not paying attention. Yeah. You're down to 26.
All right, so I see a good number of government agencies, but we seem to have a good mix of folks here today. So that's great. All right, give you guys a few more seconds. All right, next poll question. I skipped that. Okay, what is a characteristic of a resilient shoreline? So this one, you just type in an answer. These are great. I see a lot about vegetation, buffers, bounces back after storms, space to migrate. Flexible, great. All right, a few more seconds. Mitigates flooding, lots of open space. These are all great. All right, I'm going to move to the next one, I think. Okay, what is your knowledge of or experience with living shorelines? All right, so a lot of people are fairly familiar with living shorelines. That's great, good to know. See a few more responses coming in. Okay, next question, final question. What do you see as the biggest barrier to planning and implementing shoreline projects? And this one is going to show up as a word cloud. So try for one word responses, or you can try 2 words with a hyphen and it will keep them connected. funding, permitting, coordination. All great. Okay, excellent. These are great answers. Thank you all for participating. So I am going to stop sharing now. And I am going to introduce our facilitator for today's session, Steve Schott from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Suffolk County. He is a marine botany and habitat restoration specialist. He has worked for Cornell Cooperative Extension's marine program since 2000, conducting eelgrass and wetland restoration and monitoring. And he oversees most of the habitat restoration program activities at CCE, including design, planning, and implementation of restoration projects.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Elizabeth. So we have two presentations today. The first one is split between two presenters. The first presenter will be Katie Friedman. Ooh, hold on a second, I lost my prompt here. The second presenter will be Anthony Allen from Save the Sound, both of them. Katie manages Save the Sound's New York Ecological Restoration Program, including river restoration, living shorelines, and green infrastructure projects in Westchester, New York City, and Long Island. She has over 10 years of experience in urban watershed restoration and aquatic ecology. And then the second half of the first presentation will be given by Anthony. Anthony is the Director of Restoration Strategy at Save the Sound. He builds collaborative and catalytic partnerships and projects that remove dams, restore marshes, and absorb stormwater from city streets. He brings his entrepreneurial, collaborative mindset and background to the work of ecological restoration. With that, I will mute myself and we will start with Katie.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all so much for joining this breakout group. So we'll be talking to you today about a couple case studies and lessons learned about living shorelines, both in New York and Connecticut, from design through implementation. Next slide. Next slide when you're ready. Thanks. So if you haven't heard of Save the Sound before, we are a regional environmental nonprofit. We work across both New York and Connecticut to fight climate change, save endangered lands, protect the Long Island Sound and all the rivers that flow to the Sound. And Anthony and I in particular work closely with nature to restore our natural ecosystems. Next slide. So Save the Sound has many different teams. We have a climate team, a water quality team. Anthony and I are on the ecological restoration team, and our ecological restoration team has over a decade of experience, primarily in Connecticut, focusing on river restoration, green infrastructure, watershed planning, and coastal restoration. So my task is to expand all of that work further into New York, whether that's by serving as a project manager, which is our main role, partnering with municipalities or other NGOs, or at a minimum, just bringing folks together to discuss important issues. Next slide. So I won't spend too much time on these next few slides because it sounds like a lot of folks have good background on living shorelines, but I did want to call out the Living Shorelines Academy. This is a really fantastic resource from the EPA, Restore America's Estuaries, and the North Carolina Coastal Federation. Their definition up here talks about living shorelines as stabilizing shorelines, but also preserving our natural ecosystems. Next slide. So hardened shorelines that we see all the time throughout the Sound, such as bulkheads and seawalls, are really traditionally used, but these typically provide short-term solutions and actually can exacerbate erosion in adjacent areas. Whereas, as we know, living shorelines provide so many different ecological benefits. They tend to be more cost-effective over time, and because these are living systems, they're able to grow and adapt as our sea levels rise over time. Next slide. And if you are like me and like nitty-gritty fun facts about all the different co-benefits of living shorelines, I definitely recommend you visit NOAA's website in the bottom corner, coastalscience.noaa.gov. Here, there's lots of information about the co-benefits ranging from carbon sequestration to wave attenuation and water quality benefits from living shorelines. Next slide. So one of the biggest projects we have going on in New York is called the Big Rock Wetland Restoration in Queens. It's named after this big rock that you see, this glacial erratic. And this is a living shoreline project in Queens that involves both salt marsh restoration and oyster reef habitat. Next slide. So on the left here, you can see a project locator map. So this is in Queens, right at the Nassau border. There's a peninsula that juts out into Little Neck Bay called Douglas Manor. And on the map on the right, you can see a close-up, an aerial of that peninsula. This is located in Udall's Cove within Little Neck Bay. And this community has shoreline that encompasses a recreational field. You can see it's called Memorial Field down there. And then a large impounded wetland dominated by Phragmites that goes north up to that big rock, which you can actually see in the aerial as well. And so this project spans that full shoreline, but as I'll be talking about in a bit, it can be broken up into different phases for implementation. Next slide. So this is an area where there were extensive wetlands historically. They were filled largely in the 1950s, and the remaining wetlands that you can see here, we have some native Spartina hanging on, are eroding. We have Phragmites in this impounded marsh, and this community really recognized the need for not only wetlands restoration, but that because these wetlands are eroding, their shoreline was becoming damaged, both along a major roadway and a recreational field. Next slide. This community has an environmental nonprofit, a local group called the Douglas Manor Environmental Association, and they were able to really galvanize the community. They hired an engineering firm to come up with designs. They held a series of design charrettes. They even coordinated with schools to build wetland-themed curriculum. And they hold a conservation easement on a portion of the project site. Next slide. So this has been really a community-led design process, and the Douglas Manor Environmental Association worked with many partners listed here to do a lot of site analysis. So that ranged from wave fetch to salinity and nutrient measurements, groundwater and surface water, sediment coring, topo, and wetland delineations to really get a sense of what are the existing conditions along this shoreline and how can we help protect it. Next slide. So this is a resulting design, really beautiful rendering. We're looking here at Memorial Field, the recreational field, and then moving all the way up to the big rock on the right. And this design is calling for 2 rows of oyster castles. These will be really fantastic for wave attenuation, for helping to trap sediment landward and protect the marsh. Other design components involve regrading to a gentler slope along Memorial Field and planting with native species in order for the marsh to actually be able to migrate upland over time as sea level rises, which is really unique for a community to be open to that concept. And then further, thank you, that's great. So that first phase is along Memorial Field that I just described, that regrading. And then the final phases will be north of Memorial Field up to that big rock. Again, we have the rows of oyster habitat. We have restored tidal flow into the impounded marsh and plantings of native species. And then up against that roadway there, that's Douglas Road. It's a critical route for the community. That roadway is really becoming eroded and undercut. So up along that edge, there's different bioengineered stabilization techniques that were designed based on the energy of wave action hitting the shoreline. Next slide. Here is an image. We're looking south from the big rock down along the project site. You can see some of that Spartina hanging on there. And then on the right side, you can see a lot of erosion and undercutting and roots getting exposed right along the shoreline and along the roadway. And so the next slide, we will see a rendering of what this design will entail from the similar perspective. So we have our oyster castles, we have our salt marsh, and then up against that bank there's a different types of bioengineered techniques, riprap with plantings and timber crib wall, all based on the wave energy. Next slide. So the Douglas Manor Environmental Association has these fantastic designs, and they reached a point where they didn't have the capacity or the expertise to fundraise for implementation and do construction oversight. And so that's where Save the Sound is coming in. And we're really excited to help lead on this implementation. Next slide. So far, we have applied for and received funding thanks to the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. Thank you, NIFWIF. We've also received funding from congressionally directed spending, thanks to Congressman Swazi. And then we've applied for funding both through the National Coastal Resilience Fund. We applied for $2.4 million, and that's a nationally competitive application. And then to New York State funding through the Consolidated Funding Application, their Marine Habitat Grant. Other progress that we've made, we've been in contact with regulators, following up. We've received coastal consistency determinations from Department of State, the New York City Local Waterfront Revitalization Program. We've had some preliminary review by Army Corps and have had a lot of really helpful back and forth with the New York State DEC, particularly most recently on ensuring that the substrate along the shoreline is solid enough for our oyster castle installation. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. And most recently, we've been contracting an engineering firm. Next slide is great. Thanks. I guess I will say about the engineering firm, we're really excited for them to be able to finalize the designs, get those final permits, and then put together a bid package for us to be able to go out to bid in construction. And one of the last slides I have is really a shout out to all of the fantastic partnerships that this project involves. I saw in one of the polls, folks talked about coordination as a big hurdle. So this has been a really wonderfully coordinated project where the landowners on board, the Douglas Manor Association, we have the Douglas Manor Environmental Association who really spearheaded all of this, Udall's Cove Preservation Committee, Hofstra bringing students out at a drop of the dime. New York City Parks has a really fantastic living shoreline project around the corner. So we're going to be learning best practices from them. New York City Audubon is actually going out and doing bird surveys and seeing any changes before and after construction, working with local schools, and really important to us, we've reached out to the Matinecock Tribal Nation to ensure that they're aware of this project and really look forward to building that relationship with them over time. And hopefully if we get more funding, the Bill and Oyster Project can get involved and start monitoring some of those oyster castles. Next slide. So we're really thrilled to be part of this project and look forward to updating you as we progress. Thanks so much. I'll turn it over to Anthony.
Thanks, Katie. And hi, everybody. I just want to say I was originally thinking, oh, I want to call out some of our friends in the room, but there's too many friends in the room. I think it would take up all my time. So it's good to see everybody, even though cameras are off. So for my part of this, we really just wanted to talk through and try and address some of the more common barriers. And these are barriers that we've experienced, but so I was kind of glad to see that in the word cloud earlier, they resonate with a lot of you as well. So you can go to the next slide. So we're just going to talk through a few of these, and I'm going to use a case study from our Chittenden Park Living Shoreline Project and Guilford Coastal Resilience work that is in Guilford, Connecticut, working with the town of Guilford, to kind of talk through how we are trying to address these barriers to implementation before the implementation phase, or at least try and dampen their impact on our ability to get the project done when we get to that point. So permitting particularities and timeline, I'll just say a few words about each of these. There was just a question in the chat about, is there a formula or some kind of standard way of determining how much one of these projects will cost to design and implement? Unfortunately not, and for that same reason, it's hard to say exactly what permits are going to be necessary. And you can have a general idea, but each site is different, and the design that you come up with at the end of the design process will have a lot to do and a big impact on what permits you actually will need. So permitting particularities and timeline is one of these. Funding competitiveness on a national level. There's been a lot of talk today already about, the private land ownership along our shorelines in our region. And, that combined with the rate of marsh loss that we've had and sort of historic fill and all this, like we saw at Big Rock, means that when you put the typical or even some of our largest marsh complexes and potential shoreline restoration projects up against those you'd find in coastal Louisiana or Florida or California, it's going to pale in comparison when you talk about acreage and you talk about potential impact and the scale of the project. So how do we combat that? How do we become more competitive on a national level as a region? And then the lack of applied best practices regionally, this is connected, I think, in a way to that. We're thinking a lot about best practices and trying to share them out, this format and others. But the fact remains that there are still only a handful of living shoreline projects that have been completed in the Long Island Sound region. So trying to learn from that, I think the creation of the NER, the Connecticut NER, the Connecticut National Estuarine Research Reserve, is going to be big, I think, hopefully, in helping us have some sustained monitoring to figure out what's working and what does work in our region. But for right now, it's hard to point to a bunch of great examples and say, this is exactly what worked. We're learning as we go. And then finally, valuation and understanding of nature-based solutions. This is tough, and it's come up in chat a couple of times today, and I amplified one of those remarks. We focus a lot, and some of the biggest funding sources we have for this kind of coastal resilience work, namely FEMA and the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, focus a lot, and in their scoring really weight heavily impacts to human infrastructure in the built environment, and do not include or adequately weight impacts to natural infrastructure and connected ecosystems. So we'll talk about that too. Next slide. So this is sort of what I'm going to run through, and the ways that we're trying to do this on Chittenden. So permitting complexities and timeline. Unfortunately, we don't have a magic pill here, but early involvement and coordination with the permitting agencies can go a long way in terms of making sure they're aware and informed throughout the process, so that you're not getting hit with big changes and hopefully and permit requirements when you're at the 1 yard line. For funding competitiveness on a national level, bundling projects together and advancing them together. So working more at the scale of nature rather than the scale of politics. So the work that Circa's done around zones of shared risk, and thinking about the role of nonprofits or councils of government, even in looking at projects across a region that makes sense in terms of natural relationships, can help us to attach a bunch of smaller sites together to make a really compelling project. And then for the lack of applied best practices, I think we need to stop waiting until a project's done to think that we can learn from it, and rather include people, as many people as are willing to be involved, to get them involved early on and keep them involved, so we learn together. And then valuation, understanding of nature-based solutions, developing a better understanding of the holistic costs and benefits. I don't think there's been a lot of work done on this in the economic sphere that has not really come to bear on the restoration sphere and the resilience work as much as it possibly could. So next slide. Okay, so this is our case study. This is in Guilford, Connecticut. You have the West River here. I don't know, actually you probably can't see my cursor, but the West River is just to the west of where the red arrow is there. And as we zoom out there, you can see it's just sort of to the east of New Haven for those who are less familiar with the state of Connecticut. Next slide. So this is where we picked the project up at, right? So the South Central Regional Council of Governments, who I think are in the room, hooray for y'all, as well as GEI, who I know was part of a larger group. I'm not sure if they're in this room or not. And MMI, now SLR, did this conceptual design, and that's what we took and applied for final design funding, which is a good sort of phased approach to doing these things. So we now have the funding, and we're working to advance this concept design to final design. And this may change quite a bit during that process, but I wanted y'all to have an idea of sort of the sense of scale we're talking about. 2.5 acre site. It's not huge, but it is a really important site ecologically. Next slide. Okay, so this is where we get into what we're doing and how we sort of thought ahead of time about GEI is in the room. Hey guys, how we thought ahead of time about what was going to help us move this project forward. And so we were able to build this into the funding application. So Chittenden being a great project that was called out in a lot of different local and regional planning was critical. So as you're doing your hazard mitigation planning and local climate resilience planning, hopefully keep that in mind, that those documents, the more they build on one another, the better case you have for a single site as sort of an anchor. And that's how we use Chittenden in this application as our anchor to say, this is a really important project. It's been acknowledged that it needs to get done. It's ready to move forward. And at the same time, it's part of this much larger, really significant East-West River marsh complex that's critical for a lot of species and for resilience. So we want to bundle that all up together and select 2 to 3 other sites in the area around Guilford in that marsh area and tee those up for design, much the way that we found the Chittenden project. That's where we want to get those other sites to, so we can move those forward as a bundle. And then we formed a project advisory committee, and we got a huge response to this from both local stakeholders, experts, some of whom are in the room. I know Katie Lund's here, she's been part of that. And it's been great to meet with those folks regularly and check in on the project and ask for some advice. We've learned a lot from that. Next slide. And this is sort of what those additional sites look like in brief, or at least what we're going to be doing with those. And again, the goal is to build a project pipeline. A lot of these planning documents exist out there, but we need to start moving them forward. And I would advocate that we try and find ways to move them forward in clusters or groups wherever possible. So we're going to be doing this, and we're going to be taking input from local stakeholders as to which sites might make that list. Next. On permitting, this is just sort of a list right here of what we are currently thinking we'll need in terms of permitting on this project. And we did recently have an initial conversation with the Army Corps of Engineers and Connecticut DEP, and Town of Guilford obviously is a project partner, so they've been weighing in the whole time on local permitting requirements. But we ran this by them, and so far it looks like approximately what we'll need. Obviously, we won't know for sure until the design really gets underway, but this is what we're planning on. Okay, and then as far as benefits and costs of nature-based solutions, I've mentioned that this is a really important site. It's also very much at risk. It's sort of a gateway site to the rest of the marsh complex. And it also has, some really important community open space infrastructure behind it. But, and I should mention that the erosion at this site is really extraordinary. It's losing about 50 feet a decade right now in terms of the erosion of that shoreline. and it's lost about almost 400 feet to date. So it's a critical site to work on, and it's ranked very highly for salt marsh sparrow habitat, and you know, this marsh complex is really important. But you know, we actually went pretty far down the pathway with the folks at FEMA trying to explore BRIC, building resilient infrastructures and communities funding for implementation for this project, or even for design. And basically at a certain point we were told it's not going to work because the benefit cost analysis that FEMA runs, or that you have to run to get this FEMA funding, would put it at less than a 1. In other words, the cost of the project would probably be more than the benefits that would accrue from it. And so thinking about that and that needing to change, there's two things that FEMA and other funding sources that are focused on community resilience think a lot about, is vulnerable communities and repetitive loss. So next slide. So I would argue this is a vulnerable community. We don't talk about it like that, right? We think about vulnerable communities being the human communities, and that is critically important. And we can't let nature's voice get lost in that. And so as we think about constructing and designing and constructing nature-based solutions, nature needs to have a voice in that. So, you know, this is just one example. Salt marsh sparrow has been seen on this site. It's an important site for them, and they're losing that habitat. Next. And then repetitive loss. What about repetitive loss of connected ecosystems? We're losing marsh and tidal wetland at an alarming rate in our state. You know, you can read more about that in 100 different places, but it's important to think about these things, not just from the human perspective. And so Save the Sound will be undertaking a small project to try and start to identify some of the more low-hanging fruit from other people's research and work, to try and build into an expanded version of that FEMA BCA that we can then advocate perhaps for them to incorporate more of these considerations into their calculus. Next. So in summary, think bigger than a single project and collaborate. Collaboration is critically important in an area that's as small, relatively speaking, as the Long Island Sound region. Coordinate early and often with the permitting agencies so you don't get hit out of left field with something, and so that they know, and it's respectful to them too. Setting up structures and channels for real-time knowledge sharing, like that project advisory committee, so it's happening in real time and it's not something that just gets saved to the end and then it gets put in a report or, you know, a single webinar. And then advocate for that more holistic understanding and appreciation. This gets also to like traditional ecological knowledge, where, you know, when we think about what is a stakeholder, who is a stakeholder? Well, the salt marsh sparrow is a stakeholder, right? So thinking about that and trying to build that thinking into more of this work is going to be really important. That's all I got.
Thank you, Anthony and Katie. Are we going to take any break, Elizabeth, or are we just going to move right into?
Let's go into the next one, and then we'll do questions for everybody at the end. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat.
All right, let me. So our next presentation, we have one presenter, but he represents a group of collaborators. So Peter Gillespie is a planner with the town of Brook. He has been a practicing planner in Connecticut since 1986. He has led a wide range of planning studies and implementation projects over his career and has been recognized with several awards for his work. He will be the project manager for the Westbrook, Old Saybrook, Clinton, Fenwick Coastal Resiliency Planning effort that he will be discussing today. And you're all set to go, Peter?
I am. Can you hear me? Very good. All right. Thank you, Steve. I'll try and get through these slides as quickly as possible so that you're not backed up for time for questions. So as Steve indicated, this is a project about collaboration. As you can see from the first slide, we are working together with our neighboring communities. We all have common needs. We have lack of staff. So we thought it would be ideal if we could share our resources, get together, and go forward with a coastal resiliency plan. So I'm going to speak about our efforts before we conduct the plan to submit an application to the Long Island Sound Futures Fund for a planning grant. So if we can go to the next slide. If you're not familiar with the communities that we're representing, we're in Middlesex County, south central area of the state. We're in the lower Connecticut River Valley Council of Governments. The communities have frontage on both the Connecticut River and Long Island Sound. I think we have combined a total of about 15 miles of shoreline. Next slide. These are small communities. Westbrook's population is about 7,000. Old Saybrook's about 10,000. But we share a combined land area of 47 square miles. We share several watersheds. We're all have common characteristics. We're beach communities, and our population increases reasonably dramatically in the summertime. A couple of photos there of both Clinton and Westbrook, so you get a sense of the density of development that we experience along our coastline. Next slide. The interesting part of this, each of the four communities are kind of at a different level of expertise with coastal resilience, as you can see on the slide and was mentioned earlier. This is a view of a living shoreline project recently completed in Old Saybrook. I think you saw pictures earlier from the construction phase of this, but here's a reasonably completed aerial shot of the improvements that were made there. So you've got Fenwick and kind of Old Saybrook at one end of the spectrum, and then Westbrook probably at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of our shared levels of experience. As I mentioned, we share geography, and the bottom line is that we all agree that the coastal impacts that we're experiencing are not going to recognize our individual town boundaries, so therefore the need to work cooperatively and collaboratively together. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, some of the other factors, we've got all sorts of development pressure along our coastal zone. We've been realizing that many of our neighborhoods and beach associations have been implementing projects that aren't looking at the big picture. We have a number of beach associations, each with sort of competing interests and individual projects being implemented without giving greater consideration to the common good. Fortunately, we've got great political leadership, which allowed us to all get together and do this project. Once again, fortunately, there was funding available through the Futures Fund, and we realized that this planning effort will create opportunities for, hopefully opportunities for implementation funding, and also for economies of scale in terms of sharing the costs potentially with the projects that might come out of the planning study. Next slide. So a lot of work went into the grant submission in a relatively short period of time. So I've just listed some of the steps that we went through to get to an application submission that was in mid-May of this year. The conversation started over a lunch meeting in mid-March. We shared some information that several of our beach associations were considering projects. So that kind of started the conversation about, let's step back from these individual projects and sort of look at the big picture. So, and then fortunately, the Futures funding notice came out also about the same time. So our timing was important. We then met at a staff level. We then went to the boards of selectmen and councils in our communities to have that conversation. And fortunately, the political leadership supported the effort right before the application deadlines were on us. And then we filed in mid-May for the application. Next slide. These were some of the major events that we had to accomplish in that short 2-month period of time. Obviously, we had to get buy-in from all 4 of the communities. We actually reached out to another community who decided not to participate. We had to then reach out to various key stakeholders in the community and get their buy-in. We had to recruit other partner organizations, which I'll speak to in a little bit. We also had to document that support. As was mentioned earlier, we needed written letters of support to accompany our application, so that requires some coordination. We had to recruit planning committee members and volunteers. Very important, we had to identify our in-kind and financial matching funds that were required for the grant that was also mentioned earlier. We had to do a little bit of background research on some work that had already been done. And then also we had to develop a reasonably detailed scope of work for the planning effort. So there were a number of things that had to be done in a short period of time. Next slide. These are some of the, not all of the partners, but these are some of the partnering organizations that have agreed to work with us. The Nature Conservancy, the Connecticut chapter of Audubon, Connecticut DEP, the Sea Grant, Connecticut River Conservancy. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we are all beach communities. Westbrook, I think, has 17 individual beach associations. Fortunately, there's an umbrella organization that's agreed to work with us, but we're gonna find that that's a very important component of our partnerships in the community. Next slide. I talked a little bit about the scope of services that's required for a plan such as this. These are some of the more significant elements of the scope that we will have to pull together. Obviously, a big component is community engagement, education, and outreach. That was a vitally, that's going to be a vitally important part of our effort to develop a consensus on the recommendations that come out of this planning study. We had to identify some of our vulnerable populations in all of the communities. We do have certain demographics and certain census tracts and census blocks that we are going to make sure we put extra effort into outreach during the planning process. We're going to be doing a vulnerability and risk assessment to identify our assets and those that are going to be most or potentially most impacted by our resiliency efforts. If we can go back, yeah, there we go. We're going to have to go through our prioritization exercise. And then really important as we want to pursue funds for implementation in the future, we're going to have a component in the RFP that identifies conceptual plans and comes up with some cost estimates so that we have those on the shelf for future funding opportunities. And then lastly, obviously, we're going to have the final coastal resiliency planning document. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, community engagement, education, and outreach are going to be critical aspects of this planning study. I would love to hear from other communities who have come up with effective engagement strategies and to hear what has worked for them. But we're going to, as you can see from this slide, we're going to implement a whole variety of different efforts to get as much public involvement, education, and outreach as we possibly can. We're going to have a website platform dedicated solely to the effort. As I said, we're going to reach out to vulnerable populations. We're going to convert documents to several languages as they get distributed in the communities. We're going to have virtual as well as in-person meetings. Obviously, one of the benefits of COVID is the use of hybrid meetings. We're finding that works pretty well, and we have populations that might not be able to attend public meetings. As a beach community, we're also going to have to be sensitive to the time of year and the time of day that we host some of these workshops. We've got, as I said, 15 to 20,000 people who don't live in the community outside of the summertime. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about how we reach out to that population. We're going to have a whole variety of workshops. We're going to use some, conventional, traditional outreach through local papers and some of our other traditional legal notices and such. And then we're going to use Esri story maps to provide, get the message across in a more simplified and graphic way for our residents. But at the end of the day, we're going to let the 4 communities decide for themselves what's the best way for them to reach out to their communities. Next slide. One of the things we are doing right now as we speak is we're forming our own coastal resiliency committee. I thought this might be helpful for those of you who are considering doing that as well. Our committee will report directly to our Board of Selectmen. It'll be staffed by the Planning Department. We will have our first selectman as an ex officio member. We think that's very important that our top decision maker is involved in this process and involved in the committee. And then we've got some broad representation from various boards, commissions, business community, at-large community, some of our permitting agencies, and obviously our beach associations. So we are ramping up for that right now. Next slide. And I just want to, reach out, and I think some of these folks are sitting in on the workshop today. Many thanks to our partners, Carl Kilduff, the town manager in Clinton, Marilyn Ozels, she's a staff person for the borough of Fenwick, Christina Costa, the town planner and director of land use in Old Saybrook. Many thanks to them. As was mentioned earlier, I benefited when we put our application together from the insight and the observations from these folks as we submitted our application to the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. So many thanks to them, and I look forward to working with them on our planning process. Our next steps are, we're going to start this planning process up in the beginning of the new year. It's going to take, I believe, about 18 months to go through this process with the 4 communities, but we're all eagerly looking forward to moving forward on this effort. If anyone has any questions and would like to talk offline about this, feel free to take down my information. I'd be happy to share our experiences with anyone who's interested. And that's it for me, Steve.
Thank you, Peter. So it looks like we have at least 10 minutes for questions if we're going to try to stay on schedule. So let's take them from the ones that were typed in. Sorry, I'm just pulling up and making sure I have the most updated document here. All right, so we'll start with the first presentation with Katie and Anthony. Right. So for Katie and Anthony, how important is it for the community to have the community involved in the planning process for shoreline projects?
Yeah, I can just say that with the Big Rock project, it's a really fantastic example of the community being involved. I think, there's many components of why it's important. One is that in this instance, the land is owned by a homeowners association. And so folks in the community who've been, bought into this project and really spearheaded it from the beginning have been able to consistently communicate with, their fellow landowners and the board of the homeowners association, the importance of this project over time. And particularly as, hurdles arrive, like permits taking longer and shifting schedules, it's really critical to have that communication with the community and have them really on board. And then secondly, as well, really nice to have the community learn from the process. And this community in particular has really dove into the educational component. So this project is not just about protecting their shoreline and restoring habitat, but they're really educating members of their community and also public school students about the importance of this work in their natural ecosystem. So yeah, really critical. And Anthony, if you have anything to add, go ahead.
I just quickly add that, thinking about who the community is on a project that you want to bring in, is not just always thinking about who are the owners of the site or who are the communities directly adjacent to the site, but especially when we're doing this coastal work, it can, especially if it's sort of at the estuary of a river or something, it can have a lot of impact on upstream communities. And I would also suggest that, if you are working on a public site or a site that has the potential for public access to the Long Island Sound is something we really, don't have enough of. And so thinking about that as an opportunity to, as you're doing these projects, to get communities that are not on the water to the water, and get folks who from communities that are underserved or lower income to the water and to the natural resources that you're working to protect and restore for all of us.
And then there was a follow-up for that, which at least in Katie, what she was saying with the community, you have a community that owns the property. This wouldn't have been as difficult, but what advice do you have for building stakeholder support?
Well, for us, we will never do a project if we don't have local partners in that community. It's just not, I mean, we're a regional organization. We can't be, you know, as intimately aware and involved of community and dynamics and needs in each individual community. So we don't ever do a project alone. So a lot of times it is starting with the community partners we know or who ask us to come into a project. If we do choose to do that project, you know, that has a lot to do with how much support we feel like we can have and how much opportunity there is to bring other people who are not currently aware of the project in through the project itself. So it's incredibly important, and it's not, you know, it's not something that we ever do alone. So I think trying to build community support and engagement, you know, it's not just sending emails and mailings, it's building the partnerships with the groups who have the relationships.
I'll
Okay.
just add to that really quickly. Getting involved in community events that already happened, so that the community is already organized in that area, is a really great way to connect and tell folks about the project and bring them out to the site physically too.
All right, thank you. So this question goes to Peter. And I was thinking this too when I first heard about his talk, is what were the challenges of getting multiple towns to come together? You did say that one municipality decided not to become involved in the project, but it's a lot of like trying to corral cats, it seems, working with multiple municipalities. So if you could give us some of your experience on that, and how would you suggest people try to, you know, maximize their competitiveness on a national level as municipalities, or even just on a local, with working together?
Well, I think the fun with collaboration is just beginning for us. We just you know, got together and came up with this project when the rubber hits the road and we start having meetings and getting committees involved and getting community input amongst 4 different communities. That's when I think we'll experience all the problems. You know, surprisingly, we didn't have a whole bunch of difficulties getting the application pulled together. We had great collaboration at the staff level and at the political level to support this effort. I think the one thing was that only 2 out of the 4 communities were able to come up with matching funds, cash funds. The others were agreed to in-kind volunteer services to get our match levels up to where they needed to be. So we were fortunate, and we had some money set aside for the coastal resiliency planning effort, and Old Saybrook did as well. So that might be the one takeaway, was the matching funding availability, readily available anyway.
Okay, so we did have some questions from the audience. One of the questions which was answered, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, was asked by Al Krupski regarding how to provision in budgets, evaluating your projects afterwards, so your post-construction monitoring. And Anthony had a very detailed and pretty complete, but if you just want to touch base on, any of you want to touch base on that, and I can actually offer some experience from the projects that we've done post-construction monitoring on as well.
Steve, I would say go for it, because as you just saw, you know, Save the Sound is relatively new to this work too. So we have Big Rock will be our first implementation. So we haven't done post-construction monitoring yet on one of these living shoreline projects.
All right, so my experience in New York, in most cases, that, and other people can chime in. I know there's some consultants on it as well, but your regulatory agencies for the permitting process are going to require a period of monitoring post-construction. Most cases, at least in the projects we've done at Cornell, it's been 5 years post-construction. We've had depending on our funding sources, we've had the ability to roll that into the budget. In other cases, because projects are done in a certain amount of time and that money dries up, so a 2-year budget, you need to figure out how you're going to fund that through other projects. So we're able to kind of leverage other projects and still get those regulatory requirements done. But if it can be rolled into your project budget from a funding agency, absolutely do that. And if not, then again, you'll have to get creative, because in most cases it's going to be a mandated activity that, and as Al had mentioned in his follow-up, we need to follow these projects to show whether they've been successful, not successful, or where the issues have been. I'm getting a notification that we are going to get kicked.
Yeah, we got 45 seconds, so.
Anyone have anything else that they would like to say before we?
I just wanted to maybe try and answer Tripp's question a little bit from the chat, because I think it's a really important question. He asked how the planning and implementation problems we identified change as we move into communities experiencing environmental injustice and underserved communities. I think there's a couple of things that jump right to mind. One is how you do stakeholder engagement and relationship building needs to change, because well, for a lot of different reasons. I mean, there might be language barriers, you know, they're often lower income communities, and so there's a lot of other stressors and problems that are a lot more immediate than
All right, welcome back, everyone. As you can see, we're going to take a quick stretch break and see everyone back here at 3:20 for our next round of breakout rooms. So see you in 5 minutes.